A lot going on in Iraq. And so joining us via Zoom is one of our colleagues, Janatan Sayeh. He's a research analyst at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Jonathan, I hope you can hear us. Can you hear me?
I can.
Unconditional surrender. What's your take on the latest going on the ground, but also in region?
So the situation has of course been escalating. I think we're all looking at how the military capabilities have been degraded, but what has been really notable about this campaign is the scale of the attacks against the repression apparatus. They've been targeting IRGC siege bases, and the communication to Iranians has also been unprecedented. So the mindset on the ground is increasingly revolutionary. The idea is that Iranians are awaiting instructions either by Washington or the Crown Prince as opposition leader to take to the streets for the final knockout, in accordance with what the president noted early on, that this is there to facilitate change, but that does not mean Washington is there to finish the job that is up to the Iranian people.
Inside, because the strikes were going to be happening early on. I mean, how do you think the Iranian people are doing a weekend? What's the sentiment on the ground? What do you think that they're waiting for?
We have to go back to how this was communicated to them. It was clear that this is an attack against the Islamic Republic. And we have to keep in mind the regime for the past half a century has not been representing Iranian national interests, or at least that's how Iranians see it. The idea is that Iranian nationalism inherently clashes with the regime's Islamist project. Now, within that framework, you see a major divide, of course, between the ruling entity and the people. So which means any external attack in this context would be really perceived as aiding the movement. Yeah, I think as the people were pleading on the ground, and as they saw President Trump tweet out and mention that help is on the way, that greatly resonated with folks. Even talking to people on the ground, I remember explicitly being told by them that they're taking to the streets because Trump said help is on the way. So that is critical. We cannot underestimate how the average Iranian is receptive to any calls from Washington. I think ultimately it comes down to the scale of how we're going to pivot from this phase of the war to the next. I think once the military capabilities are degraded and we can ensure that Tehran can no longer retaliate in a meaningful way, that's when we would enter the new chapter. I think the details are still being sorted out. It really comes down to how we're going to either bring out the masses or go after a hyper-local targeting. But really the momentum on the ground still exists. Iranians were mourning the death of 40,000, but now they're increasingly really, I guess, looking forward to moving on from that and moving on to the next chapter and take their destiny into their own hands.
Can I ask, Jonathan, you mentioned moving from one phase of the war to the next. Can you give us a forecast? What does the timeline look like in your view? What signs should we be looking for in terms of further weakening of the IRGC and the regime stranglehold?
You're right to point out the IRGC because that entity has been leading the regime's war efforts. Of course, Islamic Republic does not really have an air force. Goes without saying that their naval capacity is really weak and has even been further decimated. So it comes down to their missiles. We were talking about thousands of them. I think in the beginning of the war there was about 2,500. That has been greatly weakened. That said, I don't think we're going after the silos. We're going after their launching capabilities, and that's crucial. So as to what signs we're looking for, we're looking at any really major decrease in Iranian ballistic missile attacks, and we've already seen that. So having started launching about a few hundred a day to less than 100 as the war goes on tells us that, one, their command structure has been weakened, and two, their military capabilities are no longer there. Now, we talk about the new chapter and the timeline of it. I think the president noted that they're ahead of schedule. I think in both cases of this wave and the 12-day war, both entities were surprised by how weak the Iranian military infrastructure was. In both cases, I think the operation was finalized before they were expecting it. So I think it's coming a bit too soon. They're still preparing as to how they're going to go about it. I know there's some discussions about leveraging different groups within Iran. We have not seen necessarily a unified form of armed resistance inside the country, but what we do have is the masses. So given that they were able to come out in millions in January, right now we can realistically expect those numbers again. So you'd really be talking about on a very neighborhood level of Iranians really going after the entities that have been repressing them. And of course, they are the most familiar with their environment. They know exactly who to target, but comes down to effective coordination from the opposition based here in Washington.
Thanks, Jonathan. Maybe Ylber, last question for you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jonathan. You are obviously very familiar with various opposition actors inside Iran and outside of Iran. What's your sort of read of the situation? Do you see any figures emerging around whom the opposition could potentially coalesce, particularly in the scenario that you talk about in which people pour back into the streets?
Certainly, we do. We have a very clear understanding. So having grown up in Iran myself, I partook in the 2009 protests. And back then, the idea still was to get reform within the system. So the quote-unquote opposition leaders at the time were still regime officials. We are far past that point. Iranians think there is no way out but through, but we should not underestimate the Iranian national identity. So any leader that is going to, of course, thrive to expand this ongoing momentum needs to ensure that he brings national stability. We need a unifying figure. So when we look at the largest anti-regime demonstrations in the Islamic Republic's history, it happened because the Crown Prince Pahlavi called on protests to take place. And Iranians are increasingly unified, not based on only how they want to go about regime change, but how they see the dynamics playing out post-regime collapse. They want a transition figure at least, and that's the only person, Pahlavi, that could actually lead that and facilitate that from regime collapse to the ballot box. I do think the most damaging approach would be if we were to pursue any separatist agenda, really enforcing ethnocentric policies in the Middle East and arming certain factions that do not have national identity or have ties to terror groups has never worked out in America or Israel's favor. So really we want to ensure that whether it's Iraq or Iran or any Middle Eastern country, we see a national identity emerge. It would be easier for us to diplomatically engage with them, and it would further stabilize the Middle East instead of balkanization that would lead to different chaos and groups emerging throughout the region.
One more question, Jonathan.
Yeah, Jonathan, thanks so much for all of your insights. So the work that we do here at SCSP is always focused on national security and technology. And one of the key things I think we've emphasized from the very beginning of SCSP is this idea that we need to dominate and win in the race for global digital infrastructure, right? Because if in this race competition between democracies and autocracies, if we're not controlling the infrastructure, then a lot of things fall apart. When we see what the authoritarian regime in Iran is doing, one of the key questions I have is is there control over telecommunications and information going into Iran, right? So can you give what's your sense of how are people in Iran getting the information about what's actually happening on the ground there, what's happening with the war? How are people figuring out what's actually happening with the conflict rather than just getting the propaganda that the regime is pushing out?
You point out an excellent development here. When we talk about the regime repression, oftentimes we're focused on the physical side of things, whereas the really multifaceted nature of it comes down to the digital repression. As you pointed out, they've monopolized the telecommunication space. They've tapped in, of course. Tap in is not even accurate. They own it. They own the entire infrastructure, whether it's cell, satellite, but more importantly, the internet apparatus. And that is because a lot of the information and technology they've imported from Beijing, specifically when it comes to surveilling Iranian dissidents and later on going after them. So when it comes to communication, I think there's two pillars. One, how Iranians can get information from the outside, and two, how they can communicate with each other on the inside once the situation escalates and for them to need to increasingly coordinate. So The first part comes down to internet blackouts. We've seen what happened last month. Right now, we're seeing the longest internet outage. But that said, there's still more videos emerging than it did a month ago, even though the blackout has been going on for longer, which tells us there's been other contingency plans in place. We saw more Starlinks be used inside Iran. We're increasingly seeing more and more use of satellite dish TVs that Iranians are getting information from the outside. The opposition has also started a radio wave. So there's numerous really channels for communications to Iranians inside. So getting information in has always been easier than getting information out. The other angle is how we're going to connect them with each other. So the opposition has developed this secure app that once Iranians download, they'll be able to communicate with one another should the blackout intensify. But ultimately, if you ask any Iranian on the ground how they perceive the current, I guess, situation, paranoia is definitely part of the issue, because if you're Iranian, you access your phone to simply order food off of let's say, a certain app. The regime has tapped into that. They know where you are. They will come and locate you. This is something that's happened before. So because of that, that has posed a major challenge for Iranians to coordinate. But increasingly, we're trying to overcome that. And once we see the masses come out, I do think hopefully some of these issues would be navigated once the conditions escalate. And last point on that is, I do think a lot of the attacks has really struck this command center, the surveillance equipment. The fact that they're not as capable of shooting down the internet completely, I think in itself says that some of these people that are involved in this have either been eliminated or their capabilities has been decimated.
Jonathan, thank you so much for your time and your insights. Truly incredible. Thank you again. That was Janatan Sayeh with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thank you again. We'll continue the conversation here with David and Ylber. I'm going to ask our team to pull the graphic that I think best summarizes the objectives of this war, and they were put online by the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and then we'll have a conversation here in the studio. So first, the graphic you see, I think clearly there was a lot of conversation over the week. What are the objectives? And I think to put all these conversations down, I think Marco Rubio tweeted the 3 key core objectives of the war. David, what's your take on how the week has progressed? What's going on in the region? What's going on in Iran? Over to you.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, starting with those objectives, as Jonathan mentioned, there's a severe degradation in Iran's ability to project power via what used to be the largest ballistic missile arsenal in the Middle East. We have reports, I think, by the Israel Defense Forces Chief of Staff that the launch capacity, the number of launchers Iran has for those missiles, is down by 75%. On the home front in Israel, they've moved restrictions yesterday from essential activity to limited activity, which is a big change, an indication of confidence that from the Israelis that they are taking out Iran's ability to project that power. Iran's response has been to try and force its Gulf partners into pressuring Washington into ending the conflict. We've seen, actually, compared to the 12-day war, much more of Iran's fire capability directed against its Gulf neighbors than against Israel itself, which is a notable development. As Jonathan mentioned, now the phase in terms of the Israeli strategy is, in addition to continuing to degrade those capabilities, it's also moving to target the internal apparatus of repression in Iran. So that's a second phase of the war for Israel. I think it's important to mention as well, Ylli, this broader context. Iran has had a long-term strategy known as the Ring of Fire, and that was really conceived and executed by Qasem Soleimani before his assassination under President Trump's first term. This had 2 functions. One was to encircle Israel, bring about its demise through proxy forces, including Hamas, Hezbollah, which was the jewel in the crown of that ring, Shiite militias, Iraq, Syria, Houthis in Yemen. And the second function was to provide a deterrent from Israel striking Iran's developing nuclear program. And I think all that we're seeing this week indicates the complete collapse of that strategy of Iran's Ring of Fire. We haven't seen the Houthis joining in. We've seen very limited activities from these Shiite militias in Iraq. Of course, the Assad regime, since the collapse of the Assad regime, no involvement from Syria. And Hezbollah, it seems under a lot of Iranian pressure, has entered the fray, and they're now paying a heavy price
Right.
this week.
By the Israeli strikes. Ylber, your take on what happened this past week?
Yeah, so by this evening we'll be a week into this war, and I think we're shifting into a new phase in this conflict. I think the U.S. military appears well on its way to establish air superiority over portions of Iran that stretch from its southeast all the way to its northwest. This obviously will open up new opportunities for CENTCOM to increase the pace and the scope of the strikes in Iran. The new phase also appears to move, as David suggested, beyond sort of the retaliatory capabilities to now decimating Iran's defense industrial base, and underground facilities as well. David mentioned that Iran had the most active ballistic missile program in the region. They also had one of the most active underground facilities program. So that's sort of an element of the new phase as well. It's important to remember this is a two-part operation. One is the Israeli operation, the Roaring Lion, and then the Epic Fury, which is the U.S.-led. These are coordinated, but they are pursuing vastly, I think, different objectives. There's synergies, but it's important to mention this because the stopping of one operation will not necessarily mean the end of the other operation. So they each are progressing towards their own objectives. One thing I would say is worth watching is the Strait of Hormuz. This is a narrow waterway that touches the coast of Iran. This is where upwards of 25% of world consumption of petroleum goes through. Also, about 20% of the liquid natural gas also goes through. Shipping has kind of paused through the strait at this point. So I think the question is, what's the near-term plan to recommence the transit of shipping through this important waterway?
Joe?
Yeah, no, I mean, one of the things we haven't quite touched on in more detail today just yet, it really is the continuing highlighting of the importance of drones in modern warfare, right? I mean, yes, I'm 100% correct in terms of how Jonathan, David, and Ylber, you guys talked about how we've taken out a lot of the missile capabilities that Iran has. But I think one of the key things that we've seen is how damaging that the drones, that the Shaheeds at Iran, the stockpile that they built out obviously is doing an incredible amount of damage both in Israel, in Iran's neighbors, and so how the U.S. partners in the region can actually respond to that is a key thing that is pretty interesting that we'll need to keep track of. And the Ukrainians have obviously been doing this for a very long time, and I think they volunteered, as Zelensky has talked about, how Ukraine is ready to step up and provide some counter-drone capabilities that they've built up over the years to partners as well. So I think that'll be interesting to see. I know we'll have Gavin come on and speak up on some of the regional developments as well. But I think one of the things that we need to keep track of is, it's only been a weekend for this conflict, right? As and we're in the fog of war. We don't quite know where the end state's going to be. And we haven't talked a lot about China or Russia just yet, right?
Right.
And obviously they're watching, they're waiting, and that's the other thing that we always need to keep in mind, right? They're over the horizon, waiting to take advantage of any trip-ups, any slip-ups that we have in the region. And so I think that's the other thing to keep in mind.
Right. Before we turn on to Gavin, I'll just say 3 points. Joe, I think militarily, so far this has been an incredible success. I think degrading their capabilities both internally as an infrastructure, but also the capability to threaten their neighbors, I think has been a huge success. I think economically, Iran has never been more isolated. I mean, this morning, UAE froze their assets, and I think that tells you all what you have to know. And I think politically, when you think about it, Russia didn't come to the rescue, even though we have intel, reports today that they're providing targets for the American assets, I think, which is, I think it will bring a new element and a new factor in this conflict. But I think Iran is politically isolated, militarily completely degraded, and I think economically even more under strain. So I think let's see how far this goes. But I think the president's tweet this morning that this is he's looking for an unconditional surrender. I think this is probably what the end game should look like.
If I could just add on Joe's great point about the drones, and I would make 3 points. First is the U.S. indicated that the rate of drone attacks from Iran has been decreased to 85%, by 85% from the initial salvo that they were able to launch. So that's encouraging to see. Second is the CENTCOM commander yesterday called the Lucas, which are the U.S. one-way drones repurposed from a seized Iranian drone. He called them indispensable. So that's interesting because we didn't see that in Midnight Hammer last year. We didn't see U.S. use one-way drones. And third thing, and again, the CENTCOM commander mentioned this, is that they have deployed capabilities in the region that are now changing the cost calculus for countering the drone attacks. So in the past, we relied on expensive Patriot missiles, other missile defense assets to shoot down Iranian drones. He said that now they've been able to invert the cost equation, and they have fielded capabilities that are 10 times cheaper than what an Iranian drone costs.
Ylber, thank you, because you just answered the YouTube question, which was how's the U.S. using AI on the battlefield in Iran? So thank you for that. Let's move over and just talk to Gavin a little bit about what the East Asia theater looks like, because Japan gets like 95% of its oil through the Strait of Hormuz, and I think obviously this will put a lot of strain. So Gavin, over to you.
So yeah, the security implications and the energy supply chain disruptions of the Iran-US-Israel conflict are being felt far beyond the Middle East. East Asia, and particularly our allies Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, are very concerned and are watching this conflict very closely. As said, the supply chain disruptions of energy and financial shocks have really not been felt in this way since the Yom Kippur War in 1973, when OPEC cut off oil. Japan imports about 95% of its oil from the Middle East through the Strait of Hormuz, which has been cut off. Japan currently only has a supply of 250 days left of crude oil to sustain the country. Similarly, liquefied natural gas supply is only at about 3 months, and so if this conflict is to turn into a more prolonged war or military operation, this could prove very disastrous for supply chains in the very resource-scarce Japanese home islands. Beyond just energy supply chain, the security implications of this are maybe the most distressing concern for our allies in East Asia. Currently, we only have one carrier stationed in East Asia right now. It is the USS George Washington, currently under repair in Yokosuka, Japan. And Japan is very concerned that if this is to turn into a more prolonged war, we will have to take our U.S. Navy assets, which are already stretched very thin in the Western Pacific and East China Sea, out of East Asia to support the war effort in the Middle East. Currently, only 40% of U.S. Navy ships that are operational are already stationed in the Middle East, and any more military actions in the Middle East would require us to draw our assets out of East Asia, leaving China a very critical opening to push further into the Pacific and to potentially encroach on Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. Japan has been seeking reassurance from the United States that it will not move its military assets out of East Asia. They point to previous examples of the war in Afghanistan, where as that turned from a very small operation into a 20-year-long war, we were forced to move our military and U.S. Navy assets out of the South China Sea, leaving China many opportunities to militarize the South China Sea islands, which has proved very disastrous in recent years. Japan has taken moves to combat this on their own by installing fighter jets, moving them from Japanese home bases onto Ioto, formerly known as Iwo Jima, in the Pacific Ocean, and similarly has announced the deployment of medium-range surface-to-air missiles in Yonaguni, the westernmost island of Japan, 60 miles from 60 miles from Taiwan, in the event of a Chinese invasion.
Gavin, fascinating. Thank you so much for
thanks so
joining
much,
us.
Gavin.
We'll talk to you and keep monitoring this East Asia, theater about the implications regarding the Iran. Joe, I think we move on to the next topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this week has a lot of developments on the China front as well. So we have David Lin on our team and Caroline Armstrong to talk about a few things. First, David, over to you. Do you want to talk through where we are on China and their latest 5-year plan?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Thanks, Ylli. It's a big week in Chinese domestic politics. Beijing is convening its 2 sessions, which is an annual convening of their 2 most important political bodies, the National People's Congress and the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, the CPPCC. The 2 sessions are normally just a routine annual convening where senior Chinese government officials pass the annual budget, formalize policy initiatives, announce new appointments. But this year is unique because it's the two sessions are approving their next 15th five-year plan, which is the Beijing's five-year roadmap. Covers a lot of stuff. So they just published the 15th five-year plan yesterday. It's 140 pages long, so there's a lot to parse through. So I really wanted to spend, so I really want to spend the next 90 minutes
Which model
going
would you
through
use to summarize the conversation?
So the internet, actually, crowdsourcing. NPC Observer, it's a website where they post some of this stuff, and I checked this morning, and there's like 15 people on this document translating the Chinese the document. So
I wonder if
it's
anyone's like deep seek the document to see like how deep seek wants to.
right. No, and you know, words matter, right? And so there's a lot of, you know, you can debate all day about how do you translate some words into English. But the 15th five-year plan covers the whole waterfront of policy issues, but I wanted to focus on the tech issues today. And just three quick things kind of jump out at me. And no, I haven't read the whole thing yet. There's, you know, this will dominate the China watching community for the coming weeks. But three things jumped out at me. One, and we can unpack each of these a little bit, but first, the key theme across the 15th five-year plan was self-reliance. It's listed as objective number 2 after objective number 1, which was more focused on economic growth. But objective number 2 was focused on self-reliance. So that's one thing we can talk about. The other thing was just the prevalence of a focus on S&T breakthroughs and laying the groundwork for future industries, or industries of the future, as they call it. And then the third thing that really jumped out at me was a new feature for this 15th five-year plan, which is this whole initiative that Beijing is launching called AI+. So going back to self-reliance, there's a whole section called Win the Battle for Key Core Technologies. And there's a really interesting passage here where it says, you know, Beijing will focus on strategic vital areas and weak links in the industrial and supply chain. And Beijing will adopt, quote, adopt extraordinary measures to achieve decisive breakthroughs in key core technologies. And so this is this extraordinary measures language is also really interesting because it just further brings home the point that self-reliance is going to be one of the key priorities for China for the next 5 years. And they lay out layers of the tech stack where they want to focus. Integrated circuits, industrial machine tools, high-end instruments, basic software, a whole list of them. So that's really interesting. The second piece is focusing on new frontiers of S&T, where they want to lay the groundwork for industries of the future. AI, unsurprisingly, is number 1. And again, another thing to realize about this document, right, is, and Ylli, I know you worked the national security strategy. Every sentence, every punctuation, everything is put there by design. And so I think this is a rare case where we can kind of overinterpret the listing, right? Number 1 is number 1 for a reason. Number 2 is number 2 for a reason. So number 1 is AI. Number 2 is quantum. Number 3, interestingly, is what they call controlled nuclear fusion, which is a promotion from the 14th five-year plan. In the previous 14th five-year plan, fusion was listed as just a major S&T infrastructure project, but this year, this time, it's being listed. They elevated it, yeah. And then 4, 5, 6, life sciences and biotech, brain science, and innovative drugs. All really interesting. Now, lastly, is AI+. This is a new feature for the 15th five-year plan, and again, brings home the importance that Beijing is putting on AI as both a driver for economic productivity, but also national power and national innovation. And so under AI+, they announced 6 new AI+ initiatives, including AI+ Science and Technology, which sounds a lot like our own Department of Energy's Genesis mission, which is the idea being applying AI to science, applying AI to the next generation of scientific discovery. And then AI+ industrial development, integrating AI into increasing the productivity of traditional industries. And then 3, 4, 5, 6, consumption, health, governance, global cooperation. So a lot to unpack, but all kind of showing us the policy demand signal for China over the next 5 years, specific to tech.
Fascinating, David. 100+ pages summarized in 4 minutes.
That's right.
By you.
That's right.
I mean, look, to me, what's 3 topics that I think stood out to me was number 1 is really the lowering of the growth target.
Yes, that was
I
the
think
big
this is a
econ
big issue, and publicly admitting that I think is not something that China does most of the time. The second issue was really putting an emphasis, what you mentioned, on physical AI and 6G, which is also like always staying ahead, thinking ahead. And the last one is really increasing the defense spending, to additional +7%, which is, a public number, and, the classified number is never available, from the Chinese sources anyway. But those were three things that I think, stood up for me.
No, I think for me, I think it's, number one, I think it's always good to remember, these are still rooted in core communist ideology, right? Like these guys are going after what they've called, back in the original documents, the commanding heights of the global economy, right? Because if you control these key sectors of the economy that are going to shape the world, you control the world, right? And so I think if you look at integrated circuits, industrial machine tools, high-end instruments, basic software, advanced materials, biomanufacturing, all of those things are the key parts of the industrial supply chain that really matter for everything everywhere, right? And so if China dominates in those areas, as we've seen them, in 5G, in telecommunications, in EVs, they are planning to again dominate the future industries that are going to drive economic growth in the future. And even if they're lowering expectations for growth now, so if they exceed those expectations, it's like, hey, we beat our goals, right? So in some ways, it's you kind of lower expectations to kind of to be able to beat them, but also clearly again they're focused on figuring out how they can reorder the world in a way that Beijing is again the center for political and economic influence.
Right. Anything else you want to add, David?
No, I mean, from the announcement of the 15th five-year plan, the whole Chinese ecosystem will now pivot to this document as their guiding light. So private industry, private capital, SOEs, all the rest of it will start marching to this direction.
Right.
And so we'll be expecting a lot of new announcements citing the 15th five-year plan coming out of China in the coming over the next 5 years.
Moving on, Joe, to our next topic, which is also related to China. From the beginning of SASP, we have really focused on providing some kind of a net assessment between our technology leadership and Chinese technology leadership. We used to produce the gap analysis, but I think with Caroline and David now here, we upgraded this to a tech scorecard. So I know we have graphics up there to put, but over to you, David and Caroline, to really tell us how is this different, what does it entail, and how do you assess the latest, tech scorecard between U.S. and China?
Right. So we're excited to launch the first installment of our tech scorecard series. This first installment really just lays out the methodology and the analytic framework behind that methodology. And really, partly by coincidence, partly by design, we are launching this and coinciding with the 15th five-year plan because, coming out of the 15th five-year plan, coming out of the two sessions, U.S. policymakers will be asking themselves, okay, China has listed their priorities. Where does the U.S. stand? And this analytic framework lays out a methodology by which you can start to gauge where the U.S. and China are in the tech competition. Caroline, do you want to kind of walk us through the methodology and the analytic framework?
For sure, yeah. So exactly as David said, the thought behind this was that the news about tech competition is only getting more and more noisy, especially after this launch of the five-year plan. There's going to be more headlines coming out. And figuring out how to find that signal through the noise is incredibly complicated. So what we are hoping to do with the tech scorecard is to put a structure around that to help policymakers, to help tech watchers be able to understand quickly and with nuance how the tech competition is shaping up, where the advantages are and where the challenges are for both the US and China across core technologies. These critical technologies are the ones, a lot like David was talking about in the five-year plan, where there are sort of key national power strategic questions at stake, whether that is dual-use technologies where there's a direct national security implication, whether it's, as Joe was talking about, those technologies that are going to drive the economies of the future, or if it's technologies where there is a first-mover advantage and the first country to achieve a certain breakthrough will have sort of a prolonged, enduring leadership in that area. All of these are places where it's really important to understand who is ahead, who is facing more challenges, and how that ecosystem is shaping up. So if we go to the next graphic, what we have developed here is a framework that aims to provide a level of comprehensiveness around the question of what is the status of the tech competition. We've developed 5 categories: innovation, leadership, industrial capacity, market ecosystem, the talent pipeline, and national leverage. And our thought around this, as David and I were looking, is of the existing metrics that are out there, a lot of them are too narrow. They don't cover the breadth of these categories. We think that all 5 of these pillars are going to be really important.
Patents and publications, for example, high impact research is a popular metric that a lot of people use to measure where US and China stand in a particular tech sector. But of course, that'll look different when you're comparing, more nascent technologies versus more commercialized technologies. People aren't necessarily publishing as much on aircraft engines as they are on, real, scientific breakthrough nascent sciences like fusion or quantum, for example. And so this accounts for that by applying that one metric amid a whole body of others under these 5 categories. And so it helps adjust this framework to technologies depending on where they are when on the technology readiness level scale. So it's an adaptable framework that we think we can apply to a whole range of technologies that China has laid out in their 15th five-year plan, and we plan to do so. Our first one is coming up in the next few weeks, focused on robotics. We'll be publishing one on quantum and another one on autonomous vehicles. So keep an eye out for them as we start rolling them out over the course of the year.
Awesome. Thank you so much, guys, for joining us. Joe, let's move on to the next topic.
Yeah, by all
we
means.
have a graphic on March 4th. The president hosted major tech companies at the White House where they signed the Ratepayer Protection Pledge. This was also a topic at the State of the Union, which we covered last Friday. So we will be joined by 2 of our colleagues, Nick and Caleb, to talk about what this is, what does it mean, and where do we go from here?
Yeah, no, I just moved to Virginia, so as a new Virginia resident, I know, like with all the data centers here in Virginia, it's energy prices are something that I'm obviously keeping track of with all of the energy requirements that AI is going to require, and obviously that's one of the key reasons why the president called this meeting to make sure that he can lower the prices for ordinary citizens in terms of how energy is a huge part of inflation and all the considerations that people have about their day-to-day lives. So yeah, Caleb and Nick, great to see you.
Absolutely, thank you. So starting with the facts, 2 days ago on March 4th, the White House hosted leaders of 7 big tech companies to sign this Ratepayer Protection Pledge. The pledge itself is a voluntary commitment on the part of these companies, OpenAI, xAI, Meta, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and Oracle, to pick up the tab for all energy infrastructure costs associated with their data centers, even if they don't end up buying electricity from them. This includes the cost of building new power plants, as well as transmission and distribution lines. The president mentioned the pledge in last week's State of the Union address, and the effort is spearheaded by the Office of Science and Technology Policy Director Michael Kratsios, as well as Energy Secretary Chris Wright. Previously in January, the White House released a joint statement of principles with a bipartisan group of governors calling on PJM, the Mid-Atlantic grid operator, to expedite the interconnection process, lower the cost of electricity, and make data centers pay their fair share. So taking a step back, what is the significance of this pledge? It looks like it's the latest development in the administration's affordability strategy in the lead up to the midterm elections.
Yeah, let's do a little bit of analysis after those facts. I think there are 3 questions that need to be answered. Question 1, is this really a change? Question 2, is it going to bring down costs for consumers? And question 3, is it going to increase our ability to scale AI? So let's talk about question 1. Is this really a change? Now, keeping in mind that this is a voluntary commitment that kind of puts a limiting effect on what this can be. So at any point, these companies could renege on what they want to do, and so that would mean nothing really happened. But when it comes to the major change that is in this agreement, it is the fact that these companies are agreeing to pay for electricity costs to the utilities, whether or not they end up using them. So if they plan a big data center, that plan falls through for some reason, they still end up paying the utility. And so that could end up bringing down costs. That's the scenario in which that happens. But there are a couple things that aren't addressed when it comes to cost. And so one of that is scarcity. So right now, if you want to buy a natural gas turbine, there's a 5-year wait list if you want to buy that from Siemens, and it costs twice as much as what it did a couple years ago. This is not going to be addressed by that. Similarly, some of the permitting reform that really would bring down costs, not addressed by this agreement, but it is a topic in vogue and very much could be addressed separately. And then lastly, is this going to increase our ability to scale AI? It is absolutely true that the ability to scale AI is so directly tied to energy. And so for these companies to be able to have electricity and have backup electricity, which is also required here, is certainly going to be a good thing for our ability to scale AI.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us and for making sure we understand what this pledge means. I'm sure this will continue for the next 3 years in this administration, so we'll look forward to having you back.
Thank you.
Joe, this past week, we also published another incredible report by our colleague James on the Army and AI adoption. So over to James to explain a little bit about what the report entails and his findings.
Thank you so much. So we all here recognize the great degree of impact that AI is likely to have on the future of work and the future of the workforce. There's been a lot of work done in the private sector looking at how much the civilian economy might be impacted. People like Goldman Sachs and the IMF have calculated a very significant degree of exposure for many civilian occupations. But no one has previously really looked at how the military workforce might be impacted by these kind of changes. And so we sought to change that. We basically took two approaches. First, we looked at the Army Officer Corps in particular because the Army covers a wide range of functions, and because the officers who lead the Army are going to be the ones who are going to be making key leadership decisions in the future. And so we looked at the range of what the Army sort of has their officers doing. In many cases, their Army officer functions, or what they call military occupational specialties, have a pretty strong parallel to things that are done in the civilian sector. So for example, a judge advocate general has a strong parallel to a civilian lawyer. And so we were able to map a significant majority, so about 131 of the total Army military occupational specialties for the officers are mappable to a civilian equivalent out of a total of 177. But the most interesting and most impactful things the Army does are things that are very unique and not found in the civilian workforce, so combat-related functions in particular. And so consequently, because we didn't have an existing civilian data set to draw upon, for those, we went out and we surveyed Army officers to look at the impact of basically the impact and complexity of the tasks that they do at a high level. So we chose to focus on two of those specialties, the infantry officers and the artillery officers. And we went out and conducted a survey of current and former personnel to get a sense of their tasks and their importance. So what we found was basically that every single Army MOS that we looked at is going to be meaningfully impacted by AI, ranging from 25% of the workload impacted at the lowest level to 64% of the workload highly impacted by AI at the highest level. We also found, interestingly, that when we split the difference, or when we asked combat functions about the impact of AI on their combat tasks as opposed to their garrison tasks, we actually found a slightly higher degree of exposure for combat-related tasks in the combat arms function relative to the peacetime and garrison tasks that they're tasked with. So what do we take away from this? So a couple of key things. First, the Army Officer Corps will not be immune to the effects of AI. Just as this massive wave of change is coming for the civilian workforce, the military workforce is going to experience just as high a degree of change. We also believe that the Army leadership is going to need to think holistically about preparing for this change. Army officers serve for very long periods of time. People who are inducted into the Army today will likely serve for the next 20 to 30 years. And the Army is going to have to prepare for how AI is going to impact the work they do every day and the types of people they need, how they're going to go out and retain those people, and how they need to think about upskilling them throughout the course of their career. So consequently, we make 4 recommendations. First, for all the tasks and time that the Army is going to get back as AI is applied to their workforce, we need to make sure that we reinvest the gains into lethality as opposed to more sort of paperwork and bureaucracy. We don't want to increase the amount of PowerPoint presentations or data calls that officers are doing. We want them training and leading their troops. Second, the Army isn't going to be able to fund custom AI models for every single thing it does. Large portions of what the Army does has a parallel in the civilian sector. And so the Army is going to need to think about how they can leverage all the massive investments the private sector is making in AI to improve the productivity of its own people. Third, We want to make sure to invest in AI for combat-related functions, especially in the areas where it looks like the AI may be more amenable to enhancing the tasks that are done under wartime conditions. And then finally, we want to make sure that we leverage AI to improve retention and reduce burnout. What we see today is that many of our most promising junior officers, people at the company level, are working really long days, 12 hours or more, trying to keep up with all the things that are on their plate. And so if the Army really thinks critically about how it can leverage these time investments to improve the daily lives of these soldiers, they're likely to keep their best people and improve their future force. Thank you.
Thank you so much, James. Again, if you have not seen the report, it's on our website, scSP.ai. Joe, let's move on to another cool topic. Anthropic just released a workforce graphic. So I'll ask our team to pull the graphic online. And we have here our resident expert, Dr. Carpenter, to talk about what's happening here.
Thanks for having me on, Ylli. So we've talked about the differences last week between rate of change and adaptability versus the rate of basically capability with large language models. And so what James was actually just talking about was that impacts the Army, but Anthropic just released a report yesterday that talks more about the larger impacts on the economy. So what you're looking at is a graph they produced that measures observed exposure. So observed exposure is their way of framing this gap between capability and adoption. And so if you look at the blue on that, that's actually, in theory, the tasks in the job that are impacted by AI. And the red is their actually exposure based on their model use in Claude. So there's some predictable things you're going to see in there. One is computer, math, science. Those are impacted. You're starting to see a gap there, a growing usage in those departments. But also, what you see are pretty big gaps between the blue and the red lines, and there's some real indicators there on what's inhibiting that. Mainly legal gaps, actually hurdles internally, and actually model capability hasn't mapped out yet to actually reach out to those corners where, in theory, AI can impact your job. So we see this. These charts like this, and so people are trying to get a sense of how to measure this, because that's the big question mark. So they're putting their foot in the sand and saying, this is how we're going to measure. And to be honest, it's hard to measure augmentation because these are just tasks that are eliminated. How do you measure human-machine teaming is a lot harder. So what I enjoyed about that chart, one, I'm a visual learner, so you can see these fields. And then actually now when they publish another report, you can see if it's growing, changing how different industries are impacted.
So Ryan, question for me, does it mean the electricians, plumbers, and all these professions are still going to be relevant and in high demand based on this chart?
Oh, definitely. If you look at the chart, the exposure and the actual, in theory, effect on those industries is negligible. Right. There is really going to be a gap there for folks and in growth in that industry, in those industries that are going to stick around for some time now. And you might see the red lines recede too, and how people are actually using their jobs and creating those new tasks, because that's the challenge. As we measure change, the change is going to happen. Well, wait, I don't have to do this task anymore. I can move to another task. So a good sign could be the blue actually recedes, because in theory, you can't actually measure those tasks. But I'd love to see more augmentation, like actual surveys of people who use these models for their job.
Yeah, no, I think with James right before as well, right? Just talking through how do we think of AI as a tool? How do we adapt and how do we train the future workforce? I mean, Ryan, obviously you're leading a lot of the work on the future of work that we're gonna launch with the commission there. I mean, it's for me, I think as a former State Department person, for me it's always how do we learn the right lessons from all of this within the government in terms of different agencies doing what DoD is doing to make sure they're pushing forward to build new skills for their professionals and think through how they can actually adapt to the new the world that we're in, right? In terms of how new tools are really reshaping how everyday work goes, both from the analytics side to the back office admin side to something more creative as well in terms of what technology and AI can really do to help on the diplomatic side, just improve how we conduct diplomacy.
Joe, next week we have a big AI Plus Education Summit, because obviously the future of professions and skills depends on the educational system. So Ryan put together an incredible agenda. So we have a big AI Plus Summit, but also we're launching our Coursera second course next week. So very exciting times here. For those of you that want to upgrade skills, they want to know what's going on in AI Plus Education. Really, next week we have a lot of announcements coming up at our AI Plus Education Summit.
Yeah, and Coursera course is always free, of course. By all means, like sign up. It's an incredible course and access to not just the SCSP developed programming, but a range of programming that Coursera has available online to help you guys upskill on AI.
Absolutely. Ryan, thank you for this. Please stay here because next we're going to play my favorite portion of the show, which is how did you use AI in the office? And this week, our colleague Piper has an incredible case of how she uses AI for her work.
Hi, I'm Piper Holland, and I'm a research assistant at SCSP, and I wanted to share how I use AI in the office. One of my favorite tools is Notebook LM. What makes this a little different from a Claude or a ChatGPT is that it's not pulling from the open source internet. Instead, it only draws from sources that you upload. So let me show you how it works. Right now, I'm working on a net assessment between the US and China on AI adoption. So one of the pillars that we're analyzing is strategy. So the way I'm using Notebook LM for this is I've implemented and uploaded all of these strategic documents so that the Notebook LM can pull from them. Then I can come into this chat section and I can ask specific questions like, can you put all of these different strategies into one document? So that's kind of what it looks like here. So I have the document title, I have which agency released this, then the core objectives, and then kind of linking that to the source. So it's summarized all of them into this table. If I want it to be more visual, I could look at it in more infographic format. So here is summarizing all of the sources that I put into the Notebook LM into a more infographic. If I like a more mind mapping approach, I can go through this and visualize my data. If you're a more auditory learner, they have the option to turn this into a podcast. So that's what's really cool about Notebook LM, that there's all these different applications and use cases that you can do a bunch of different deep diving research. So yeah, this is how I use AI in the office.
Fascinating.
Incredible.
Joe.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Love it.
I think she really gives a full spectrum, maximum use of Notebook LM, which is a great, I think, platform. I think.
Yeah, no, I think the podcast feature on Notebook I think is really incredible, right?
You
I
have
think
the interactive portion too.
yeah.
Like you can inject your question in the middle of a podcast, and it becomes like a radio show with live listeners calling in.
No, it's a dynamic way of learning. It's a dynamic way of processing information for people that like Ryan mentioned, he's a visual learner, right? If you're a visual learner, auditory learner, or more hands-on, like there are different ways to for Notebook to be able to adapt to however you want to learn. And so, yeah.
Any examples of how you used AI this week, Ryan?
So it's becoming very hard to monitor all the news coming out about AI and work. I had a Google alert, but my inbox was just flooded. So I created a digest with Claude, and now it updates me automatically. It's a little clunky because I want them to be able to interact with each other. So basically, I built a digest, and it's not automated yet, but I can't wait to actually start something that's going to give me something every day that's a feed. Because Anthropic, they dropped the report yesterday, and it just exploded. But there's also the jobs report that just came out. There's other things that are coming. And so for me to get bite-sized things that's built just for me is really critical. And I'm really excited to refine it as we go.
Thanks, Ryan. You, Joe, anything?
Yeah, again, I talked to the last time I was on the show. I talked about how I moved.
Right.
I was moving. I'm now moved, but there's so many like just housekeeping things in terms of like hey, does this thing look right? How do I buy different stuff for my cats? Like all the random things that you need for house moving, right? So I think AI has been pretty good in helping me just kind of catch up on all of the various chores I need to do for the house. I mean, it's still not finished yet,
right?
But we're getting there.
Excellent. Joe, thank you so much. Ryan, thank you so much. This was all from the President's Tech Brief this week. Please follow us on all our platforms, Substack, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Instagram. And let us know your thoughts, your comments, questions, or anything like that. And we'll see you next week.
You've been briefed.